Hey everyone! Welcome back to the channel where we dive deep into the most gripping, emotional, and thought-provoking stories out there today. We're bringing you a roller coaster of a tale, a shocking journey of betrayal, manipulation, and personal growth that will leave you questioning everything. Grace's seemingly perfect life unravels when she discovers her husband Nick's emotional affair with a manipulative woman named Claire, who has a history of targeting married men for personal gain. As Grace confronts the infidelity and deceit, she uncovers deeper betrayals, including Nick's complicity in Claire's schemes. With tensions escalating, Grace finds herself entangled in Claire's dangerous web of manipulation, leading to legal battles, personal revelations, and high-stakes confrontations. The story delves into themes of betrayal, trust, and the devastating ripple effects of infidelity, keeping the audience infuriated and captivated by each twist and revelation. So, grab a seat, settle in, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories. Let's get started. The year was 2016, and the bustling streets of Seattle were drenched in rain as usual, the water pooling into shimmering puddles that mirrored the city's glowing lights. It was one of those evenings when the sky seemed to press down on you, making the air feel heavier than usual. For Grace, though, the rain had always been a comfort, a quiet backdrop to her busy life. Grace was a 28-year-old marketing executive. Her life was a careful balance of ambition and routine, though she'd be the first to admit she leaned too heavily on the routine side of things. Monday through Friday, she worked long hours at a sleek downtown office, her days punctuated by meetings, endless emails, and cups of bitter black coffee. Weekends were her sanctuary, often spent in cozy bookstores or watching indie films with her husband, Nick. Ah, Nick. If you saw them together, you might think they were the picture of a perfect couple. They had been married for 3 years, their wedding a beautiful yet modest affair in a vineyard upstate. Nick, a high school teacher, had this calming presence about him, someone who always knew the right thing to say to ease Grace's overthinking. While Grace chased deadlines and climbed the corporate ladder, Nick worked with teenagers, patiently guiding them through math equations and the awkwardness of adolescence. Their dynamic worked, or at least it used to. But here's the thing about routines: they can lull you into a false sense of security. Sometimes you don't even realize the cracks in the foundation until it's too late. It was a Thursday evening when Grace first felt the shift. She had just stepped off the elevator to their 5th-floor apartment, her arms full of takeout bags. The smell of pad thai and garlic chicken filled the narrow hallway, but her usual anticipation of a quiet dinner with Nick was dampened the moment she unlocked the door. The apartment was dark. The only light came from the soft glow of Nick's laptop, left open on the coffee table. His jacket was draped over the back of the couch, and his shoes were kicked off haphazardly near the door. Grace frowned. "Nick?" she called, setting the takeout on the kitchen counter. She expected the usual response, his warm voice greeting her from the other room, maybe an apology for getting caught up in grading papers. Instead, silence. She walked toward the bedroom, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The door was slightly ajar, and as she nudged it open, she saw him. He was sitting on the edge of their bed, his back to her, his phone glowing faintly in his hand. He didn't look up. "Hey," she said, her voice softer now. "You okay?" Nick jumped, almost dropping his phone. He turned to her with a strained smile, but there was something off in his expression, like he had been caught doing something he shouldn't. Grace's stomach twisted. "Yeah, sorry," he said quickly, shoving the phone into his pocket. "I was just thinking about work stuff." Grace tried to shake off the unease. She told herself she was being paranoid. Everyone has bad days, right? But as the night went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, those small moments started adding up. Nick's phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter or the coffee table, was now always with him, as if it were an extension of his hand. He started coming home later than usual, citing after-school meetings or last-minute lesson planning. And then there were the glances, those quick, almost guilty looks when he thought Grace wasn't paying attention. At first, Grace tried to dismiss it. Nick was a good man. They had built a life together, one rooted in trust and mutual respect. But the little things began to weigh on her, and soon she found herself questioning everything. It wasn't until one Friday night, when Nick claimed he had a staff dinner, that Grace's suspicions turned into something more concrete. She had stayed home, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine and a rom-com playing in the background. But her mind wasn't on the movie. Instead, it was on the oddness of Nick's behavior lately. She had always been proud of how they didn't keep secrets from each other. Their phones were an open book, their schedules synced. But tonight, something gnawed at her, a quiet voice in the back of her mind urging her to do what she never thought she would. She picked up his laptop from the coffee table. It wasn't like her to snoop, and her hands shook as she entered the password, a combination of their wedding anniversary and her birth date. The home screen loaded, and her heart raced as she clicked through his files. Nothing unusual there. She opened his browser history next, scrolling past search results about lesson plans and articles on new teaching methods. Then she saw it. A series of messages on a social media platform she didn't recognize. The conversation was casual at first, discussions about work, mutual interests, but as she read further, the tone shifted. There were jokes, inside ones Grace had never heard before. Compliments that felt too personal, too intimate. And the name at the top of the chat, Claire, a name Grace didn't recognize. Her hands went cold, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more painful than the last. Who was Claire? Was this just harmless flirting, or was it something more? She felt sick, the wine in her stomach threatening to rise. Grace closed the laptop, her breathing shallow. She didn't know what to do. Confronting Nick would mean opening Pandora's box, exposing truths she wasn't sure she was ready to face, but pretending she hadn't seen anything that felt impossible. The front door opened, and Nick walked in, his face lighting up in surprise when he saw her awake. "Hey, I didn't think you'd still be up," he said, shrugging off his coat. "How was your night?" Grace plastered on a smile, her heart pounding as she tried to keep her voice steady. "Good, just relaxing. How was dinner?" "Fine, just the usual small talk," he said, heading into the kitchen to grab a drink. As she watched him move around their home, so familiar yet suddenly so alien, Grace felt her world teetering on the edge of a knife. Everything about their life together now felt like a carefully constructed facade, one she wasn't sure she wanted to shatter. Grace woke up the next morning feeling like a stranger in her own life. The weight of what she had seen on Nick's laptop pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. Was she overreacting? Could there be a reasonable explanation? But no matter how hard she tried to justify it, the truth gnawed at her. There was something going on between Nick and this Claire, something that didn't belong in their marriage. That day, Grace threw herself into work. It was easier to focus on spreadsheets and marketing campaigns than to deal with the storm brewing inside her. But even in the middle of a meeting, her mind kept drifting. She remembered the way Nick had smiled at her when he came home last night, so casual, so normal. Was he lying to her face the whole time? When she got home that evening, Nick was already there, lounging on the couch with a book in his hands. It was a scene straight out of their old life, but now it felt tainted. Grace forced a smile as she hung up her coat, her heart pounding in her chest. Should she confront him? Should she wait? The questions spun in her mind, making her feel dizzy. "How was your day?" Nick asked, his voice warm and familiar. "Busy," Grace replied, her voice tight. "Yours?" "Same, the kids are already talking about winter break, and it's not even Thanksgiving yet." He laughed softly, but Grace couldn't bring herself to join in. For the next few days, Grace tiptoed around Nick, her unease growing with each passing hour. She started paying closer attention to his habits, when he was on his phone, who he was texting, how often he seemed busy with work, and every time she noticed something suspicious, her stomach twisted into knots. One evening, as Nick was in the shower, Grace found herself standing in the hallway, staring at his phone charging on the nightstand. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, She hesitated for a long moment, the screen glowing in her palm. Was this who she had become? Someone who snooped through her husband's phone. But the memory of that chat with Claire pushed her forward. The phone was locked, but Grace knew the passcode. It was their anniversary. Her fingers moved almost on their own, typing in the numbers, and the screen unlocked with a soft click. She scrolled through his messages, her heart racing as she searched for Claire's name. There it was. The messages were far worse than she had imagined. They weren't just casual or flirtatious, they were intimate. Claire talked about missing him, about the times they had spent together. Nick responded in kind, his words filled with affection and longing. Grace's world shattered in that moment. The sound of the shower turning off snapped her back to reality. Panicked, she locked the phone and put it back on the nightstand, just as Nick stepped out of the bathroom. "Hey," he said, rubbing a towel through his hair. "What are you up to?" "Nothing," Grace said quickly, her voice shaking. "Just checking emails." Nick didn't seem to notice her distress, but Grace could barely hold herself together. She excused herself to the kitchen, her hands gripping the counter as she tried to steady her breathing. What was she supposed to do now? The next day, Grace confided in her best friend Jenna over coffee. Jenna was one of those friends who didn't sugarcoat things, and Grace needed her honesty now more than ever. "I don't know what to do," Grace admitted, stirring her latte even though she wasn't planning to drink it. "It feels like my whole life is falling apart." Jenna frowned, her brows knitting together. "You need to talk to him, Grace. You can't just sit on this." "But what if—" Grace's voice broke. "What if it's true? What if he's been cheating on me this whole time?" "Then you deserve to know," Jenna said firmly. "Hiding from it won't change anything. You have to confront him." That night, Grace sat in their living room, waiting for Nick to come home. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say 100 times, but as the clock ticked closer to his arrival, her nerves got the best of her. When he finally walked through the door, looking tired but cheerful, she almost lost her resolve. "Hey, Grace," he said, kicking off his shoes. "What's for dinner?" "Nick," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." He froze, his smile fading. "What's wrong?" Grace took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who is Claire?" For a moment, Nick didn't say anything. The silence was deafening, and Grace could feel the tension in the room thickening like a storm cloud. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost pleading. "Grace, it's not what you think." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "Don't lie to me. I saw the messages, Nick, I know." Nick's face crumpled, and he sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Then why did it?" Grace demanded, her anger boiling over. "Why would you do this to us?" Nick looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know, it just happened. Claire and I, she's a teacher at my school. We started talking and it felt harmless at first, but then—" He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. Grace felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" 6 months, Nick admitted, his voice shaking. "But Grace, I swear, I never wanted to hurt you." 6 months? Grace repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me, to us?" Nick tried to reach for her, but Grace stepped back, tears streaming down her face. "Don't," she said, her voice cold. "You don't get to act like the victim here." In the days that followed, Grace wrestled with what to do next. Nick begged for her forgiveness, promising to end things with Claire and rebuild their marriage. But Grace wasn't sure if she could ever trust him again. She threw herself into work, trying to escape the chaos at home. But even in her office, surrounded by deadlines and colleagues, she couldn't stop thinking about Nick, about Claire, about the life she thought they had built together. It was like living in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, scrolling mindlessly through her phone, she stumbled across a video on YouTube. It was about infidelity and rebuilding trust, and for some reason, she clicked on it. The narrator's voice was calm and soothing, offering advice on how to navigate the pain of betrayal. The video ended with a reminder: if this helped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And remember, you're not alone. Grace stared at the screen for a long time, the words echoing in her mind. You're not alone. It was a small comfort, but in that moment, it was enough. Grace felt like she was living in a fog, each day blending into the next as she tried to process the betrayal that had upended her life. Nick had promised to cut all ties with Claire, but promises were just words, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than he was letting on. One night, she found herself alone in their apartment, her thoughts spiraling. Nick was supposed to be at a late-night parent-teacher conference, but her trust in his words was hanging by a thread. Every time she thought about confronting him again, she felt the anger boil in her veins. But what would it accomplish? She needed proof. Driven by desperation, she reached for her laptop. It was the same one where she had first uncovered the truth, and the memory of that discovery burned in her mind. Logging into her email, she opened a private browser and typed in the name of a private investigator she had come across during one of her late-night searches. The phone call was short and direct. The investigator, a woman named Erin, had a calm and professional demeanor that immediately put Grace at ease. She didn't ask for too many details, just enough to understand the situation and get started. Within days, Erin was following Nick, tracking his movements and providing Grace with updates. The first few reports were uneventful. Nick went to work, came home, and spent his evenings grading papers or watching TV. But on the fourth day, Erin called with news that made Grace's heart drop. I followed him to a coffee shop, Erin said. He was there for about an hour, meeting with a woman I took pictures. Grace's stomach churned as Erin emailed her the images. The photos showed Nick sitting at a corner table, leaning in close to a woman with blonde hair pulled into a loose bun. Even in the grainy images, Grace recognized her immediately. It was Claire. That evening, Grace didn't wait for Nick to come home. She left the apartment and drove aimlessly through the city, her thoughts racing. She stopped at a park she used to visit as a teenager, parking her car and walking down the dimly lit path until she found a bench overlooking the water. For the first time in weeks, she let herself cry. The tears came in waves, each one more intense than the last, until she was gasping for air. She had spent so long trying to keep it together, pretending that things could go back to the way they were. But now she knew the truth: Nick hadn't let go of Claire, and maybe he never would. When she finally returned home, Nick was already there, sitting on the couch with a beer in his hand. He looked up as she walked in, his face a mix of surprise and concern. "Grace? Where were you? I was worried." She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. Don't. Nick frowned, setting his beer down on the coffee table. "What's going on?" Grace took a deep breath, summoning all the strength she had left. "I know you've been seeing her." His face went pale, and for a moment, he looked like he might deny it, but then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice trembling. "I hired someone, Nick. I have pictures of you with her." He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like he didn't know what to say. Finally, he buried his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't want you to find out like this." Grace felt a surge of anger rise within her. "Then how did you want me to find out, Nick? By walking in on you two together?" He shook his head, his voice breaking. "I was trying to end it, Grace. I swear I told her it was over. But she wanted to talk. That's all it was." "Do you think I'm stupid?" she shouted, the sound echoing through the apartment. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around behind my back, and now you expect me to believe that it's just over. That's not how this works, Nick." The room fell silent, the weight of their argument hanging heavy in the air. Nick looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what else to say. I messed up, I ruined everything, and I don't know how to fix it." Grace stared at him, her chest heaving. For a moment, She wanted to believe him, to hold on to the hope that their marriage could be salvaged. But then she thought about the pictures, about the lies, about the way he had shattered her trust, and she realized that some things couldn't be fixed. "I think you should leave," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Nick blinked, his expression turning to one of disbelief. "What?" "You heard me," she said. "Pack a bag and go, I can't do this anymore." The next few days were a blur. Nick left the apartment that night, staying with a friend while they figured out the logistics of their separation. Grace avoided his calls and texts, unable to face him without feeling a mix of rage and heartbreak. Her friends rallied around her, Jenna in particular. Jenna insisted on nightly check-ins, bringing over wine and ice cream, and reminding Grace that she deserved better. It helped, but only a little. One afternoon, as Grace was cleaning out the closet, she found a box of old letters and photos from the early days of her relationship with Nick. She sat on the floor, surrounded by memories of happier times, and let herself mourn the life they had built together. She thought about the vineyard where they had gotten married, the promises they had made to each other, and the dreams they had shared. It felt like a lifetime ago. But as painful as it was, Grace knew she couldn't let herself dwell in the past. She had to move forward, even if it felt impossible. A week later, Grace received an email from Aaron. She hesitated before opening it, unsure if she could handle more bad news. But when she finally read it, her heart skipped a beat. The email wasn't about Nick, it was about Claire. Aaron had uncovered something shocking. Claire had a history of targeting married men, using charm and manipulation to insert herself into their lives. Aaron had even found a string of online forums where Claire's name was mentioned, each story eerily similar to Grace's own experience. Grace felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her was relieved to know that Nick wasn't entirely to blame, that he had been manipulated, at least in part. But another part of her was furious. Claire's actions didn't excuse Nick's betrayal, but they added a new layer of complexity to the situation. Determined to confront the truth head-on, Grace arranged to meet with Nick one last time. They met at a small cafe near the apartment, the air between them heavy with unresolved tension. "I need you to tell me the truth," Grace said, her voice firm. "All of it. No more lies." Nick nodded, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "You deserve that." Over the next hour, he told her everything he admitted, that his relationship with Claire had started as an innocent friendship, but had quickly spiraled out of control. He told Grace about the nights he had spent lying awake, consumed by guilt, and about the moment he realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. "I hate myself for what I did," he said, his voice breaking. "But I never stopped loving you, Grace, not for a second." Grace felt tears welling in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Love isn't enough, Nick. Not after everything you've done." As she walked away from the cafe, Grace felt a strange sense of clarity. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. Grace thought she had reached her limit. She had confronted Nick, packed up the remnants of their shattered marriage, and learned more about Claire than she ever wanted to know. Yet the story refused to let her go, tightening its grip as new revelations emerged, each one more shocking than the last. It started with a phone call late one evening, just as Grace was settling onto the couch with a cup of tea. The number was unfamiliar, but something told her to answer. "Grace Richards?" the voice on the other end asked, its tone clipped and businesslike. "Yes. Who's this?" "My name is Detective Logan. I'm with the Seattle PD. I believe you've been working with a private investigator, Aaron Delgado?" Grace's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, that's right. Is something wrong?" There was a pause, and Grace could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling. "Miss Delgado contacted us earlier today. She shared some information regarding Claire Dawson. It seems Ms. Dawson has been involved in multiple cases of fraud and manipulation, targeting individuals in high-stakes relationships." Grace gripped the phone tighter, her pulse racing. Fraud. What kind of fraud? Financial, primarily. But there's more. We believe she's been using these relationships to extort money, leveraging intimate knowledge of her victims' personal lives. She's already under investigation for several cases. The detective's words hit Grace like a freight train. She had suspected Claire was manipulative, but this was something else entirely. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're reaching out to individuals who might have been affected," Logan explained. "Given your connection to one of her known targets, we thought you should be aware we may also need your cooperation as we build our case." Grace thanked the detective and hung up, her mind spinning. She sat in silence for a long time, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. It wasn't just her marriage that Claire had tried to destroy. It was her life, her stability, her trust in the world around her. And now it seemed Claire's actions were finally catching up with her. The next day, Grace called Aaron to discuss the new developments. Aaron confirmed what the detective had said. Claire was under investigation, and her history of deceit was deeper and more insidious than either of them had realized. "She's smart," Aaron said. "She knows how to play people, how to make them doubt themselves, but this time she slipped up." "What happens now?" Grace asked. Aaron hesitated. "That depends. The police will do their part, but if you want closure, you might need to take matters into your own hands." Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm not suggesting anything drastic," Aaron said quickly, "but if you want to confront her, to get the answers you deserve, now might be the time." The thought sent a chill down Grace's spine, but it also sparked something else. A sense of determination. Claire had taken so much from her, and Grace was tired of feeling powerless. If this was her chance to take control of the narrative, she had to seize it. 2 days later, Grace found herself standing outside a sleek, modern cafe in downtown Seattle. It was one of those places with overpriced lattes and minimalist decor, the kind of spot Claire would frequent. Aaron had tracked her here, and Grace had decided to face her head-on. As she stepped inside, her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Claire. She was sitting at a corner table, her phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She looked polished and composed, as if she didn't have a care in the world. Grace approached the table, her heart pounding in her chest. When Claire looked up and saw her, a flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by a calm, almost amused expression. "Grace," she said smoothly, setting down her phone. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Grace pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I'm sure you weren't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with tension, the hum of the cafe fading into the background. "I know what you've been doing," Grace said finally, her voice steady. "I know about the other men, the lies, the money, the police know too." Claire raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Is that so?" "Yes," Grace said, leaning forward. "And I'm not here to play games with you. I want the truth. Why did you target Nick? Why did you do this to us?" Claire took a sip of her coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. "Target Nick?" she repeated, feigning innocence. "I didn't target anyone, Grace. Your husband came to me. I didn't force him to do anything." Grace felt her anger flare, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You manipulated him. You manipulated all of them. Don't pretend you're innocent in this." Claire set down her cup, her eyes narrowing. "You want to blame me for your husband's mistakes. Fine. But let's not pretend he didn't have a choice. Nick isn't the saint you think he is." Grace's stomach churned at the words, but she didn't let them show. "I'm not here to defend Nick. I'm here to hold you accountable." Claire smirked, leaning back in her chair. "And what do you think that will accomplish? You think confronting me will fix your broken marriage? It won't. You should thank me, honestly. At least now you know who he really is." The words cut deep, but Grace refused to back down. "This isn't about fixing my marriage. It's about standing up to you. You've hurt so many people, Claire. And for what money power? Do you even care about the lives you've destroyed?" Claire's smirk faltered, her composure slipping for just a moment. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice icy. "Maybe not," Grace said, rising to her feet. "But I know enough." She turned and walked out of the cafe, her heart racing. She didn't look back. That night, Grace sat in her apartment, replaying the conversation in her mind. She didn't know if she had accomplished anything, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of closure. Claire's words had been cruel, but they had also been empty, the defenses of someone who refused to take responsibility for her actions. As Grace looked around her apartment, she realized how much had changed. The photos of her and Nick were gone, replaced by new decorations that reflected her own tastes. The space felt different, still familiar, but undeniably hers. She thought about the future, about what it might hold. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for, and no matter what came next, she would face it head-on. Grace didn't expect her encounter with Claire to leave her feeling lighter, but as the days passed, she realized something had shifted. Confronting Claire hadn't undone the damage, but it had given Grace the clarity to see her situation for what it was, a betrayal that started with Nick, compounded by Claire, and finally exposed for the mess it was. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. But life wasn't ready to let Grace settle back into normalcy just yet. One evening, as she was sorting through a pile of unopened mail, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk, it's important." Claire. Grace stared at the screen, her chest tightening. Why would Claire contact her? Their confrontation had seemed final against her better judgment, she replied. "What do you want?" The response came quickly. "Meet me at the park on 8th tomorrow at 3 p.m. I'll explain everything." Grace hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to ignore the message, but curiosity gnawed at her. What could Claire possibly have to say now? After a restless night, she decided to go, if only to put an end to whatever game Claire was playing. The park was quiet when Grace arrived, the crisp autumn air carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. She spotted Claire sitting on a bench near the fountain, her posture tense, and her gaze darting around as if she expected to be ambushed. Grace approached cautiously. "This better be good," she said, keeping her distance. Claire looked up, her usual composure replaced by something Grace hadn't seen before. Fear. "I didn't know who else to turn to," Claire said, her voice low. "They're coming after me." Grace frowned. "What are you talking about?" Claire gestured for Grace to sit, and against her better judgment she did. "The investigation," Claire said. "The police have enough to charge me, but that's not the worst of it. Some of the people I've worked with aren't happy about the attention I'm bringing. They've started making threats." Grace folded her arms, unimpressed. "And why is that my problem?" Claire's eyes flashed with desperation. "Because you're the only one who knows what I've done, the only one who might understand." "Understand?" Grace snapped. "You've ruined lives, Claire. You've hurt people, including me. Why would I help you?" Claire's voice cracked as she spoke. "Because I'm scared, Grace. These people don't play games. If I go down, they'll make sure I don't do it alone." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying they'll come after me too?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. "You and anyone else they think might know too much." Grace stood abruptly, her heart pounding. "I don't want any part of this. If you're in trouble, that's on you." Before she could walk away, Claire grabbed her arm. "Please, just hear me out. There's something you need to know about Nick." Grace froze. "What about him?" Claire looked around nervously, lowering her voice. "He wasn't just a victim in all of this. He knew what I was doing, at least some of it, and he helped me." Grace felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "You're lying." "I wish I was," Claire said, her eyes brimming with tears. "But it's the truth. He knew about the money. He thought we could make it work, pay off debts, start over. He even made the first deposit." Grace staggered back, her mind racing. "You're just trying to drag him down with you." Claire shook her head. "Believe me or don't, but you should check his accounts, see for yourself." The drive home was a blur. Grace's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Could it be true? Had Nick been more complicit than she realized? Her thoughts churned, a chaotic mix of anger, disbelief, and betrayal. When she got home, she went straight to her computer. Pulling up Nick's banking information wasn't hard. She still had access to their joint accounts. At first, everything seemed normal, but as she dug deeper, her stomach turned. There it was, a series of transactions that didn't add up, withdrawals and deposits linked to accounts she didn't recognize. Her heart sank as she realized Claire wasn't lying. Nick had been involved. Grace barely slept that night. Her mind was a storm of emotions, each one pulling her in a different direction. She thought about confronting Nick again, demanding answers, but the thought of facing him made her feel sick. Instead, she called Aaron. "I need your help," Grace said, her voice trembling. "It's about Nick." Aaron didn't hesitate. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Grace explained what she had learned. Aaron listened carefully, then assured her she would look into it. "If there's more to this, we'll find it," Aaron promised. Days passed, each one stretching longer than the last as Grace waited for Aaron's findings. When the call finally came, Grace felt a mixture of relief and dread. "You were right," Aaron said. "Nick was involved, but not in the way you think. He was desperate. He took out a loan to cover some of Claire's demands, but it looks like he didn't know the full extent of her plans. He thought he was protecting you." Grace's chest tightened. "Protecting me by lying to me?" "I'm not excusing his actions," Aaron said gently. "But it's clear he got in over his head. He's not the mastermind here. Claire used him as much as she used everyone else." The revelation hit Grace like a punch to the gut. Nick's betrayal had been bad enough, but now she had to grapple with the idea that he had been manipulated too. It didn't absolve him of his choices, but it added a layer of complexity she wasn't sure how to process. Grace knew she couldn't avoid Nick forever. She called him and asked him to meet her at a neutral location, a park bench in the middle of a busy square. When he arrived, he looked tired, his shoulders slumped and his eyes filled with guilt. "What's this about?" Nick asked, sitting down beside her. Grace took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I know everything about Claire, about the money, about you." Nick's face paled. "Grace, Don't," she interrupted. "I don't want excuses, I just want the truth." For the next hour, Nick told her everything he admitted to helping Claire, explaining how she had convinced him it was the only way to fix their financial troubles. He had been blind to her manipulation until it was too late, and by then, he felt trapped. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Nick said, his voice breaking. "But I was wrong. I hurt you, and I can never take that back." Grace listened in silence, her emotions swirling. When he finished, she stood, her decision made. "I can't forgive you, Nick. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I hope you figure out how to fix yourself, because you have a lot to make up for." The days that followed were quiet but tense. Claire's arrest made headlines, and Grace found herself fielding questions from curious co-workers and nosy neighbors. She tried to stay focused on her own healing, leaning on her friends and rediscovering her independence. One evening, Aaron stopped by with an update. "The case against Claire is solid," she said. "She won't be bothering you again." Grace nodded, feeling a sense of closure. It wasn't the happy ending she had once imagined, but it was an ending nonetheless. As the sun set on the horizon, Grace sat on her balcony, reflecting on everything she had been through. She had faced betrayal, uncovered painful truths, and confronted the people who had wronged her. And through it all, she had found strength she didn't know she had. The future was uncertain, but Grace knew one thing for sure. She was ready to move forward, unburdened by the shadows of her past. Grace thought she was finally regaining control of her life. After confronting Nick and unraveling Claire's manipulative schemes, she felt a sense of closure, like she could start piecing herself back together. But life wasn't finished with her yet. The calm that followed was short-lived, giving way to a storm far greater than anything she had prepared for. It started with an email. The message came from a lawyer representing one of Claire's victims. It was curt and to the point. The lawyer wanted to meet to discuss her potential involvement in Claire's schemes. Grace read it 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each pass. She wasn't involved in anything illegal, but Claire had dragged her into her orbit, and now it seemed like she was being pulled into the fallout. She called Aaron immediately, her voice trembling as she explained the email. Aaron listened patiently before reassuring her. This is probably just standard procedure. They're trying to establish who knew what. Don't panic. Easier said than done. The thought of being implicated in Claire's crimes made Grace's chest tighten. She agreed to the meeting, but spent the night tossing and turning, her mind cycling through worst-case scenarios. The next day, Grace arrived at the law firm's office, her palms slick with sweat. She was led into a sleek conference room where a middle-aged man in a sharp suit waited for her. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were piercing, taking in every detail of her nervous demeanor. "Ms. Richards," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming. I'm Daniel Ford. I represent a group of individuals affected by Ms. Dawson's actions." Grace nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "What does this have to do with me?" Ford leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the table. Ms. Dawson had a pattern of using close acquaintances to further her schemes. In many cases, those individuals were unaware of their involvement. We're trying to determine if you fall into that category. "I didn't know anything about what she was doing," Grace said quickly. "I only found out after it was too late." Ford studied her for a moment before nodding. "I believe you, but I need your cooperation to ensure we can build a strong case against her." The conversation shifted to Claire's activities, and Grace provided everything she knew: the emails, the confrontations, even the details Nick had shared about his involvement. By the end of the meeting, Ford seemed satisfied. "You've been helpful," he said, standing to shake her hand. "With your testimony, we'll be one step closer to holding her accountable." As Grace left the building, she felt a flicker of relief. Maybe this nightmare was finally nearing its end, but the universe had other plans. 2 days later, Grace received a panicked call from Nick. "Grace, we need to talk," he said, his voice urgent. "It's about Claire." Grace rolled her eyes, gripping her phone tighter. "What now, Nick? I've already said everything I need to say to you." "No, listen," he insisted. "She's trying to drag me down with her. I got a subpoena today. They want me to testify against her." "And why should that matter to me?" Grace shot back. "You got yourself into this mess." "Because they'll use anything they can," Nick said, his voice breaking. "I know I screwed up, but if Claire thinks I'm going to testify, she'll come after me. And you." Grace froze. "What are you talking about?" "She knows I'm weak," Nick admitted. "She'll threaten me, try to turn this around on me, and if that doesn't work, she'll use you to get to me." Grace's blood ran cold. As much as she hated to admit it, Nick might be right. Claire had proven herself ruthless, and if she thought Grace was a loose end, there was no telling what she might do. Grace decided to meet with Aaron again, hoping to find some clarity. They met at a quiet diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions. "Nick thinks Claire will retaliate if he testifies," Grace said, stirring her coffee absently. "Do you think she'd actually do something?" Aaron nodded grimly. "Claire isn't the type to go down without a fight. If she thinks she can intimidate someone into silence, she'll try." "So what do I do?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "I can't live like this, always looking over my shoulder." Aaron reached across the table, her gaze steady. "You fight back. You document everything, stay one step ahead, and if she tries anything, you report it immediately." It wasn't the comforting answer Grace had hoped for, but it was the only one that made sense. She left the diner feeling more determined than ever. If Claire wanted to play games, Grace would be ready. A week later, the tension reached a boiling point. Grace was leaving her office late one evening when she noticed a figure lingering near her car. Her pulse quickened as she approached, her keys clutched tightly in her hand. "Grace Richards?" the figure called, stepping into the light. It was a man, tall and wiry, with a sharpness in his eyes that set her on edge. Yes? She said cautiously. I have a message for you, the man said, his tone cold. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it. Before Grace could respond, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. She stood there, her heart pounding, her mind racing. This was no coincidence. Claire was sending her a warning. Grace reported the incident to the police the next day, but their response was frustratingly lukewarm. Without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. Aaron was more helpful, helping Grace install security cameras around her apartment and advising her on how to document any future encounters. Despite these precautions, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of her vision sent her heart racing. She had never felt so vulnerable. The climax came 2 nights later. Grace was at home, going through old documents to prepare for her testimony, when she heard a noise outside. At first, she dismissed it as her overactive imagination, but then it came again. A sharp, deliberate knock at her door. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. Silence. She backed away, her heart hammering. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You've been warned." Grace's blood ran cold. She called Aaron, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. "I'm on my way," Aaron said. "Don't open the door for anyone." Grace nodded, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The next 15 minutes felt like hours, every sound amplified in the silence of her apartment. When Aaron finally arrived, she found Grace huddled on the couch, her eyes wide with fear. "We'll figure this out," Aaron said, her voice calm but firm. "Claire's making her last stand. She's desperate." The next morning, Grace received a call from Detective Logan. They had arrested Claire's accomplice, the man who had threatened Grace near her car, and he was willing to talk. Logan assured her that this was a turning point, the break they needed to bring Claire down for good. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but the tide was finally turning. When Grace testified in court a few weeks later, she spoke with a calm conviction that surprised even her. She recounted everything, the betrayal, the manipulation, the threats, with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Claire sat across the room, her expression unreadable, but Grace didn't falter. This was her moment, her chance to reclaim her life. As the trial concluded and the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, Grace felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Claire's reign of terror was over. The days that followed were quieter, but not without their challenges. Grace knew she still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she felt like she was moving forward. The shadows of the past no longer loomed as large, and the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. As she sat on her balcony one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, she allowed herself to smile. She had faced the storm and come out the other side stronger, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free. The trial was over, and Claire's conviction marked the end of her manipulative reign. But for Grace, the journey wasn't quite finished. The courtroom victory had provided a sense of closure, but it hadn't erased the scars. The fallout from the ordeal still lingered, affecting her relationships, her sense of self, and her plans for the future. And just when she thought things were settling, a final twist emerged, a revelation that would change everything. It began with a letter. Grace was sorting through her mail, now habitually on guard for anything suspicious, when she found an envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, but something about it felt deliberately cryptic. She hesitated before opening it, her heart beating faster as her mind raced through the possibilities. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in the same sharp, deliberate handwriting. "You don't know the whole story. Meet me at the clock tower, Saturday at 5 p.m. Come alone." Grace's stomach twisted as she read the note. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to hand it over to Aaron or the police, but her curiosity, and her lingering distrust, pushed her forward. What more could there possibly be to uncover? And who would send such a message after everything that had already happened? She texted Aaron, explaining the situation. Aaron's response was immediate and firm. This could be dangerous. Let me come with you. But Grace shook her head. If there was one thing she'd learned through this entire ordeal, it was that some battles had to be faced alone. Saturday arrived with a chill in the air, the early signs of winter creeping into the city. Grace made her way to the clock tower, her nerves buzzing like a live wire. She had dressed simply, jeans, a heavy coat, and sneakers in case she needed to run. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cobblestone plaza where the clock tower stood. She didn't have to wait long. A figure emerged from the shadows, their movements cautious and deliberate. As they stepped into the light, Grace's breath caught. It was Nick. Her first instinct was anger, followed by confusion. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Nick held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I needed to talk to you," he said, his tone pleading. "I didn't know how else to get your attention." Grace folded her arms, keeping her distance. "You couldn't just call me, you had to go full spy thriller with the anonymous note?" Nick looked away, shame flickering across his face. "I didn't think you'd come if I asked outright." "You're right," Grace snapped. "I wouldn't have." He stepped closer, but Grace held her ground. "I know you don't want to hear from me," Nick said. "But there's something you need to know, something I should have told you from the beginning." Grace's patience was wearing thin. "What now, Nick? What more could you possibly have to say?" He hesitated, his hands clenching at his sides. "It's about Claire." Nick's revelation unfolded like a slow-motion car crash, each detail hitting Grace harder than the last. He explained that Claire hadn't just targeted him randomly. She had chosen him specifically because of his connection to Grace. It turned out Claire and Grace had crossed paths years earlier. In college, Claire had been a senior when Grace was a freshman, and though they had never been close, Claire had harbored a quiet resentment toward her. "She always thought you had it easy," Nick explained. "Your grades, your friendships. She thought everything came to you without effort. She mentioned you once or twice, but I didn't think much of it at the time." Grace's mind reeled. "Are you seriously telling me she did all of this because of some petty grudge from college?" Nick shook his head. "It wasn't just that she saw you as a threat. She wanted to prove she could control you, break you." Grace felt a wave of nausea. The idea that someone had orchestrated such a calculated attack on her life, all because of an old grudge, was almost too much to process. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" she demanded. Nick looked down, guilt etched into his features. "I thought I could fix it before you found out. I didn't want you to think I was part of it." "You were part of it, Nick," Grace shouted, her voice echoing off the walls of the plaza. "Whether you meant to be or not, you let her into our lives. You let her destroy everything." Nick didn't argue. He simply stood there, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know the truth." Grace stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. "You should go, Nick. Whatever we had, it's over, and I need to move on." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I hope you can find happiness again, Grace. You deserve it." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Grace standing alone in the fading light. In the days that followed, Grace wrestled with Nick's revelation. It was hard to reconcile the person she thought she had been with the person Claire had seen. Was she really so privileged, so unapproachable, that someone would go to such lengths to bring her down? Or was Claire's bitterness a reflection of her own insecurities? As Grace sorted through her feelings, she found herself returning to the lessons she had learned throughout the ordeal. She couldn't control how others saw her, or what they did in response. But she could control how she responded. She refused to let Claire's actions define her. The final confrontation came, not with Claire, but with herself. Grace stood in front of the mirror one morning, studying her reflection. She saw the lines of stress around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, but she also saw strength. She had faced betrayal, manipulation, and fear, and she had come out the other side. She reached for her phone and called Aaron. "I'm ready to make a statement," she said. "Not just in court. I want people to know the truth." Aaron was supportive, helping Grace draft a statement for the media. It wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about reclaiming her narrative. She talked about the importance of resilience, of trusting your instincts, and of seeking help when you need it. When the statement went public, the response was overwhelming. Grace received messages of support from strangers, friends, and even old acquaintances who had been following her story. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. As the months passed, Grace began to rebuild. She moved to a new apartment, started a new job, and even joined a hiking club to push herself out of her comfort zone. She wasn't looking for closure anymore. She had found it within herself. One day, as she was hiking with her new friends, she stopped to take in the view. The mountains stretched out before her, vast and unyielding, a reminder of how small her problems were in the grand scheme of things. She took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs, and smiled. The past would always be a part of her story, but it didn't define her. She was ready for whatever came next. Grace thought she had seen the last of Claire and the chaos she brought into her life. The court's verdict had sealed Claire's fate. Nick had finally stepped out of the picture, and Grace had begun the long process of rebuilding herself. But just as the dust seemed to settle, one final twist emerged. A reminder that some battles don't end as cleanly as we hope. It started with another letter. Unlike the cryptic note Nick had sent, this one bore Claire's handwriting. Grace recognized it immediately, a sharp pang of anxiety tightening in her chest. The envelope had no return address, and the postmark revealed it had been sent from the county jail. Against her better judgment, Grace opened it. The letter was short, but the words were searing. "Grace, you won the battle, but the war isn't over. You don't understand the full story, and you never will unless you hear it from me. You owe me that much. Claire." Grace clenched the letter in her hands, her anger simmering beneath the surface. Her Claire had destroyed her marriage, put her safety at risk, and dragged her into a legal nightmare. What could she possibly owe Claire? Her first instinct was to throw the letter away, to dismiss it as another one of Claire's manipulative ploys. But as the days passed, her curiosity got the better of her. What more could Claire have to reveal, and why did she insist Grace needed to hear it? After days of internal debate, Grace decided to visit Claire in jail. It wasn't forgiveness or understanding she sought. It was closure. The prison was cold and uninviting, its gray walls and fluorescent lights casting an oppressive pall over everything. Grace sat at a small metal table in the visitation room, her heart pounding as she waited. When Claire was finally brought in, she looked different. Thinner, her hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, but her piercing gaze was as sharp as ever. "Grace," Claire said with a faint smile, sitting across from her. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Let's get this over with," Grace said curtly, folding her arms. "What do you want?" Claire's smile faded, replaced by a look of weary resignation. "I wanted to tell you my side of the story." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Your side? You mean the part where you ruined my life and tried to manipulate everyone around you?" Claire's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. "I know what I did was wrong. I'm not here to deny that. But there are things you don't know. Things about Nick, about the choices I made. I think you deserve the truth." What followed was a tangled web of confessions that left Grace reeling. Claire revealed that her vendetta against Grace had started long before they crossed paths again through Nick in college. Claire had struggled to keep up with her peers, constantly overshadowed by Grace's effortless achievements. It wasn't until years later, when Claire was spiraling in debt and desperation, that she saw an opportunity to exact her revenge. "I found Nick by chance," Claire admitted. "It was supposed to be a simple scheme. Get close to him, use him to get to you, But then things got out of hand. Out of hand? Grace repeated, her voice rising. You mean you decided to destroy 2 lives instead of 1? Claire winced, but continued. Nick wasn't just some pawn, Grace. He made choices too. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Grace felt her anger flare, but she forced herself to listen. The more Claire talked, the clearer it became that Nick's involvement had been deeper than she realized. While he hadn't orchestrated Claire's schemes, he had enabled her, even defended her at times. Why are you telling me this now? Grace demanded. What's the point? Claire's eyes softened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her hardened exterior. Because I'm tired, Grace. Tired of fighting, of running. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know the truth. Grace stared at her, torn between anger and pity. She had spent months hating Claire, viewing her as a one-dimensional villain, but now she saw a fractured, desperate woman whose choices had been driven by bitterness and fear. I don't know what you expect me to do with this, Grace said finally. Your truth doesn't change what you did to me. I know, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. But maybe it can help you let go. The drive home was a blur, Grace's mind racing with everything Claire had said. Could she let go? Could she move forward, knowing the full extent of what had happened? The answers didn't come easily. But as the days passed, she found herself feeling lighter, as if confronting Claire one last time had lifted a weight she didn't realize she was still carrying. A few weeks later, Grace stood at the edge of a cliff, the ocean stretching out before her. She had joined her hiking group on a weekend trip to the coast, determined to push herself out of her comfort zone. The wind whipped through her hair, the salty air filling her lungs. As she gazed at the horizon, she thought about everything she had been through, the betrayal, the lies, the fear. It had been a long, painful journey, but she had emerged stronger, more resilient. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. One of her hiking companions, a woman named Elena, approached her. It's beautiful, isn't it? Grace nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. It is. Elena gestured to the path ahead. Ready to keep going. Grace glanced back at the ocean one last time before turning to join Elena. Yeah, I'm ready. The hike was challenging but invigorating, each step bringing Grace closer to a new chapter of her life. She had faced her demons, confronted the people who had wronged her, and rediscovered her strength. Now, it was time to move forward. Not as a victim, but as someone who had fought through the darkness and found the light on the other side. Grace's journey through betrayal, manipulation, and self-discovery had taken her to places she never imagined. As she stood on the other side of the storm, the wreckage behind her, she could finally see the horizon clearly. But as with all great stories, the end wasn't just about surviving, it was about what came next. The resolution began quietly, as most profound changes do. Grace didn't wake up one day, magically healed or entirely free from the scars of her ordeal. Instead, she rebuilt herself piece by piece, day by day, until her life no longer felt like it was shaped by the choices of others. She moved into a new apartment, one filled with light and open spaces, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic confines of her old life with Nick. She painted the walls soft blues and greens, hung artwork she had picked out herself, and filled the shelves with books she loved. For the first time in years, the space felt entirely hers. Her career flourished as well. Grace had poured herself into her work during the tumultuous months of her personal life, and her efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. She was offered a promotion that came with new challenges, new responsibilities, and most importantly, a fresh start. She embraced it wholeheartedly, finding solace in the structure and creativity of her job. Nick reached out a few more times in the months following their last conversation. His messages were remorseful, filled with apologies and reflections on the choices he had made. Grace responded sparingly at first, unsure if she wanted to open that door again. But over time, she realized that forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about freeing herself from the anger and resentment that had weighed her down. In one final message she wrote, "Nick, I hope you find what you're looking for. I've moved on, and I think it's time you do too. Take care. She didn't wait for a response, and she didn't need one. The act of letting go was enough. Claire's conviction had marked the end of her destructive schemes, but her presence lingered in Grace's thoughts like a shadow. The encounter at the prison had been unsettling but cathartic, forcing Grace to confront the depths of Claire's bitterness and the humanity beneath her villainy. It was a lesson Grace hadn't expected. Even the people who hurt us the most are often carrying pain of their own. But that didn't absolve Claire of her actions, and Grace took comfort in knowing that justice had been served. Claire's sentence ensured she wouldn't harm anyone else for a long time. By spring, Grace had found a rhythm in her new life. Her days were filled with work, her evenings with hobbies she had rediscovered, painting, cooking, even yoga. She joined a book club, made new friends, and reconnected with old ones she had drifted away from during the chaos of her marriage. One of those friends was Jenna, her steadfast confidant through the darkest moments of her journey. Over coffee one afternoon, Jenna remarked on how different Grace seemed. "You're glowing," Jenna said with a smile. "It's like you're finally at peace." Grace laughed softly, stirring her latte. "I think I am. For the first time in a long time, I feel free." "And what about the past?" Jenna asked gently. "Does it still haunt you?" Grace thought for a moment, her gaze distant. "It's there," she admitted. "But it doesn't control me anymore. It's like a chapter in a book I've already read. I've learned what I needed to, and now I'm ready to turn the page." The final chapter of Grace's story unfolded on a warm summer evening. Her hiking group had planned a trip to the mountains, a weekend of camping, stargazing, and exploring trails that promised breathtaking views. Grace had been hesitant at first. She wasn't exactly an outdoorsy person, but something about the idea of standing on a mountaintop, surrounded by nature's vastness, called to her. The hike was grueling but rewarding, each step bringing her closer to a summit that felt like a metaphor for her journey. When she finally reached the top, the view took her breath away. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks kissed by the golden glow of the setting sun. As she stood there, the wind whipping through her hair, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the pain that had taught her resilience, for the mistakes that had led her to growth, for the people who had supported her, and the lessons she had learned along the way. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. This was it. This was freedom. The story of Grace Richards isn't just a tale of betrayal and heartbreak. It's a story of strength, of rediscovery, and of the power to reclaim your life after it's been torn apart. It's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable pain, we have the ability to rise, to heal, and to find beauty in the scars. To everyone watching this, remember, life is full of challenges, but it's also full of second chances. If you've ever faced a moment where it felt like the world was crumbling beneath you, know that you're not alone, and you have the strength to rebuild. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to bring you more stories that inspire, challenge, and move you. Until next time, take care, and remember to keep moving forward.